Welcome back to the Kigali Global Dialogue. This is the Live at Kigali session on what's next for world trade. I'm Jhanvi Tripathi, Associate Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. With me are Professor Nagesh Kumar, Director of the ISID in India, and Professor Andre de Mello Souza, who is a policy analyst with IPEA in Brazil. Welcome and thank you for joining me. We have a very provocative session title, Doha is Dead. What is next for world trade? So I think I'd like to jump right into the first question. Is the WTO indeed dead? Is Doha dead? Is it possible to revive the WTO system? Andre?
I think by and large, Doha is dead. So I agree with you in that. It achieved very little. It had some achievements right in the beginning, at the outset, in the beginning of the millennium, with intellectual property rights issue area, and there was actually an amendment to a WTO agreement that was reached at that time, and trade facilitation. But there was nothing close to the substantive agreement that was expected to come at some point. But I think the WTO itself, which is different from the Doha round, is dying. It's not dead as of yet. And I would argue that it would be important to try to resurrect it, if you will, or reform it in some ways so that it can still operate. And I think it has still an important role to play in regulating trade globally.
Professor Kumar.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think Doha round was one of the rounds of trade liberalization that are conducted under the multilateral trade negotiations. So Doha was the first round to be after WTO was set up as a successor of GATT. So Andre is right that Doha round has not seen any much of action. But WTO stays as a framework for rules, GATT stays. So they continue to provide a framework for conducting trade between countries. However, the decision-making for new rounds and the further trade liberalization process, which is not happening because of the Doha getting stuck. And it is bad news, especially for developing countries, because Doha round was touted as Doha development agenda, and it was expected to, address some of the asymmetries that came into the multilateral trade system after the Uruguay round. And so it is very unfortunate that developing countries were expecting some addressing of asymmetries in the system, which could not be because Doha got
So
stuck.
then let me jump into something that segues well with where you finished. Has the WTO become a relic of the past? Is it no longer reflective of new realities, of current realities, of how development from liberalized economics has actually functioned? And it has served the purpose of lifting millions out of poverty, and therefore the WTO is no longer reacting to new realities. Professor Kumar, you first.
Yeah, I think WTO, this whole framework was designed before the debate on sustainable development goals started. And so it doesn't really pay attention to sustainability issues. So in that context, one could say that WTO is a relic of the past, but it is an essential framework of trade rules, multilateral trade rules, and developing countries need them more than the developed countries because as weaker players of the system, they need a multilateral trade regime more than the developed ones.
Andre, do you agree with that?
Yes. For countries such as ours from the global south that are economically weaker, it is very important to have a rule-based system. And an institution such as the WTO, which at least before used to have teeth, meaning it was able to implement binding rules and to punish those who violated those rules, and provided a forum where a weaker country such as mine, such as Brazil, can face the United States, for instance, and win in the dispute settlement system, which actually has happened in sugar and cotton and other disputes as well. So, but I find it highly ironic that when southern countries become more assertive and are able to actually have a voice in the WTO, then the WTO reaches deadlock and it's weakened. And not only we are unable to reach any significant substantive agreement, but the dispute settlement system itself, which was the only leg of the WTO, if you will, that was working, is now also non-operational because the United States and European countries as well, they have not nominated the judges that are necessary to keep it working.
So then, if I were to ask you, what is the one important thing at the WTO that needs immediate reform and consensus? Would it be dispute settlement?
Yes, certainly. I think revival of this appellate body is most critical need of the hour. And then beyond that, I would also say that it's high time that we reconfigure or reform the WTO's architecture to take into account the realities of sustainable development agenda. And in that context, some of the rules have become outdated. They need to be sort of reformed.
Right. So, in the meantime, while the WTO is more or less defunct, what is the route available to low and middle income countries? Are regional arrangements indeed the future of trade, or are they just filling a gap until the WTO gets its act together? What are your thoughts, Andre?
I think it's hard to say, Jhanvi, but they're certainly out there, and the regional and the preferential trade agreements, they've increased dramatically in number, and also that is obviously related to the fact that the WTO is no longer delivering. But again, they provide a forum where it's much easier for the great economic powers to impose their will on the countries that are economically weaker, which was not happening at the WTO. And in addition to that, they also don't seem to be serving the purpose of liberalizing trade. The regionalism we have today, known as the closed regionalism, is very different from the one we had before, which was seen as a step towards a greater, more extensive, multilateral free trading system. The regionalism we have today is to exclude those who are not part of the club, right? So, yeah, I'll stop here.
What are your thoughts on that, Professor?
Yeah, I agree fully with him. I think the regionalism is if at all, it could be a complement to multilateralism. It's not a substitute of multilateralism. And I also agree that the trade blocs, regional trade blocs that have come into being before WTO's inaction or in the times of GATT, like Single European Market or NAFTA, and those which are being formed now are actually protectionist, schemes to keep those who are not members of these groupings out and be at a disadvantage. So they are not really, substitutes of WTO or multilateral trading system. And we need a stronger, well-functioning multilateral trading system, which is very important for developing countries, the weaker players of the game.
Right. A thought that is, I think, coming across is one that now that the developed liberalization started working for the Global South, there's suddenly a deadlock at the WTO. And also the idea that we're facing new development challenges, which the WTO has not been able to respond to. Is there a need for new global governance on new trade issues? Or is the WTO the place to have these new global covenants, say on green trade, on digital trade, or even non-trade aspects of these things? Do you think a new covenant is required, given dysfunction in multilateralism in general? Or are there salvageable multilateral systems, Andre?
Well, oftentimes it's easier to create new institutions than to reform the ones that are already there. We see this with the BRICS very clearly, with the new development bank, the contingent reserve arrangement. But I think ideally we would reform the WTO and have it back in the game. But I realize this is very hard because if we create new institutions, and that actually it has been happening with the regional agreements and you know and bilateral agreements and what have you, you fragment the system and you lose efficiency and you have these overlapping of rules and you know and before at least all the regional agreements were subjected to the rules of the WTO to a certain extent. But if we just create new platforms, that might not be the case.
Right, Professor Kumar, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Andre, but there is now a very interesting and influential forum, which is G20, and I mean it was initially as a response to the global financial crisis, but it has over time become a very influential platform for raising global issues and finding solutions for them. And interestingly, since 2022 to 25, it will be helmed by countries of the global south. So I see opportunities for the global south to bring some of the issues of concern to them, including the reform of multilateral trading system, including bringing the sustainability concerns in the trade system on the platform of G20, get the consensus there, and once consensus between G20 countries is there, then it would be much easier to implement and translate it into WTO framework, because these are the key decision-making countries or powers in WTO as well.
Andre, do you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, I do. I think that the G20 now is the most important platform we have to try to solve global issues, including trade. And trade, by the way, as the professor put it, is also related to a host of environmental, social, and labor issues as well, which the WTO has not thus far incorporated into its own framework. So yes.
Okay, so we're very close to time. So final thoughts on how to reform the WTO. One sentence, what is the one thing that needs to change in terms of consensus building to fix the WTO? Professor Kumar, with you.
Yeah. I think, as I said earlier, that trade negotiations have become very complicated because the asymmetries of decision-making power. I mean, in WTO, conventionally, the agenda is set by Quad, what is called as Quad, US, EU, Canada, and Japan. And so developing countries have always felt that they are at a disadvantage in agenda setting. So keeping in mind the important and vibrant platform of G20, where both the global countries of the global south and the G7 countries sit together, and interestingly, these years, next couple of years, it would be still helped by the countries of the global south. So I think they should use this opportunity to shape the agenda, build the consensus, and get this to WTO for reform.
Thank you, Professor. I'm adding an element to your question, Andre. Brazil's presidency is coming up of the G20. Is it going to be an important agenda item for your presidency?
I hope so. Brazil has always valued multilateralism very much. And like I said, we do have also a successful record at the WTO. So I hope that the presidency does look at this issue with care. And I agree with the professor. We have to try to build consensus between the major powers somehow. And that's where politics and geopolitics kicks in. Perhaps some concession needs to be made by China so that the U.S. will again be willing to to appoint judges and to support the organization, and perhaps we can move forward from there.
Well, at least Asia and Latin America are in consensus in this room. Thank you so much. I think we are at time. This was the Live at Kigali session on what's next for international trade. Thank you.